Bound by Fate, written by Whisper Quill. Previously in Chapter 4. Chris stood in front of Rebecca, his expression heavy with sorrow. His heart ached for what he was about to say, knowing the devastation it would bring. He took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "Becca, I have some bad news." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and her face immediately paled. A surge of panic rose within her, her body tensing as she braced for the worst. "No," she cried out, her voice trembling with fear. The world seemed to close in around her, her heart racing as denial took hold. Her mind raced. The thought of facing the future without her mother filled her with dread and unbearable sorrow. Her voice cracked with desperation, tears welling up in her eyes. The shock was too much, the reality too unbearable to accept. "Not ever in my dreams did I think I would ever face this," she whispered, her voice filled with a deep, aching sadness. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, suffocating her with its intensity. Meanwhile, miles away in another city, Damien was still at the office, his mind far from the work that lay before him. The rain outside drummed against the window, a relentless reminder of the turmoil he felt inside. Damien couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him, a heaviness in his chest that refused to lift. As the morning approached, the first rays of light filtering through the rain, Damien finally received the tragic message. The news hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him with unbearable force. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he couldn't speak, the shock rendering him mute. His heart ached with a sorrow so deep it threatened to consume him. "I can't fathom the agony Rebecca must be enduring right now." "My mate," he thought, his fists clenching in an unbearably painful grip. Their bond went beyond the physical. It was a connection deep within his very soul. The thought of her suffering, of the unbearable grief she must be feeling, tore at his heart. Damien's mind was a storm of emotions. He knew he had to be strong for his mate, but the weight of his sorrow threatened to drown him. The night felt darker and gloomier, filled with the crushing reality of loss, a pain no amount of strength could erase. After Ellin's funeral, the somber atmosphere lingered like a heavy fog, suffocating and relentless. Everyone had come to pay their respects. The Williams, Alec, Hayley, and Damien. The gathering was filled with the echoes of whispered condolences and silent grief. But amid the crowd, Damien found himself at a loss, his emotions a tangled mess of regret and frustration. Later, after returning home, Damien paced his room, the silence only amplifying the storm brewing inside him. His thoughts kept circling back to the moment he had seen her, standing alone by her mother's grave, her face etched with grief. He could still see her face, etched in his mind with painful clarity, her eyes red-rimmed and pleading and sorrowful. He had seen the way she trembled, the silent tears that streaked down her cheeks, yet he had remained frozen, paralyzed by his own fears. The regret gnawed at him, a relentless beast that refused to be silenced. "Why didn't I just hold her?" he muttered to himself, the words a bitter balm that did little to soothe his guilt. His voice was raw, a mix of anger and sorrow that hung heavy in the air. He slammed his fist against the wall, the sharp pain a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside. "I hate myself for not doing it, for not telling her the truth," he spat out, his voice rising with the intensity of his emotions. The memory of her broken expression played on an endless loop in his mind, a cruel reminder of his failure. He knew he had to make it right, but the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. All he could do now was endure the bitter taste of regret and the gnawing ache of what might have been. Damien's eyes darkened with rage as he grabbed the lamp from his bedside table. With a force driven by his inner turmoil, he hurled it across the room. The lamp crashed against the wall, shattering into 1,000 pieces, reflecting his broken emotions. The sound echoed, a violent punctuation to his anguish. He stood, breathing heavily, staring at the shards that mocked him. The sharp knock on the door jolted Damien from his turbulent thoughts. His eyes snapped to the entrance, just as Alec stepped inside. But before Alec could speak, Damien's voice erupted like thunder, cutting through the tense silence. "I do not want to hear it, Alec," Damien roared, his fury barely contained, the words reverberating through the room with a finality that left no room for argument. Alec's voice was filled with concern and frustration. "Damien, why did you leave like that? You should have—" His words were cut off as Damien suddenly rushed towards him, grabbing him by the collar. The intensity in Damien's eyes was almost otherworldly, his anger radiating off him like heat. "Don't you dare tell me what I should and should not have done," his voice roared, the ferocity of his words shaking the very air between them. Alec's heart pounded as he realized the full force of Damien's fury. Damn, his wolf is in control, Alec thought, a shiver running down his spine. "I didn't mean to disrespect you, Alpha," Alec said, his voice strained. "Calm down, Damien. I am sorry," Alec pleaded, but Damien's eyes were now blazing red with the fury of his wolf, seemed to glow with a primal intensity. "I am your Alpha." Damien's voice was a growl, each word laced with the raw power of his wolf's dominance. Alec gasped for breath, his voice choked by the force of his grip. "Leave. Me. You're choking me," Alec managed to croak out with desperation clear in his tone. Caught in the grip of his own anger, Damien's red eyes slowly began to fade back to their normal hue. Alec, sensing the shift, called out, "Alpha?" "Damien," with concern in his voice, hoping to reach the man behind the fury. Gradually, the rage in Damien's eyes softened, the storm within him beginning to settle. The raw intensity ebbed, leaving behind a shaken, regretful man. Damien released his collar, his face flushed with embarrassment for losing control. Alec, gasping for breath, looked at him with a mix of shock and irritation. Between coughs, he managed to rasp, "Are you trying to kill me?" Damien's voice was unsteady. I lost control. I didn't mean to lash out at you like that." He apologized softly. "Of course you did," Alec shot back. "I keep reminding you of the one person you can't get out of your head. So yeah, maybe I shouldn't say this again. But if only you'd tell her the truth, Damien. It's not that easy, Alec." Damien's frustration flared. "It would make things easier for you. You're suffering." Before Alec could further continue, Damien retorted, his voice rising. "That is not true. Really. You can barely keep your wolf at bay. What if you lose control and hurt someone else?" Alec's words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the danger Damien faced. His anger flared as he glared at Alec. "Are you out of your damn senses?" "No," Alec shot back. "But you will be soon." Damien's voice thundered with fury. "I told you I don't want to hear any more of it." Alec's eyes were steely, his tone unwavering. "Get her in your life, where she belongs. She is your mate, Alpha. Damien's face reddened with rage. "I need you to leave." Alec, undeterred and seemingly reckless, pushed on. "Look, Damien. She needs you more than ever. You both shouldn't have to suffer. Just trust your instincts and tell her the truth." "I would never lose control in front of her," Damien snapped. Alec's voice was sharp with concern. "Can you make sure of it?" Alec's concern was palpable as he pleaded. "Damien, I'm genuinely worried about both of you. You mustn't stay apart from your soulmate." Damien's voice was strained with irritation. "Can we please discuss this another time?" Recognizing Damien's deep distress, Alec decided to relent. "Very well. Just don't make any rash decisions. If you're not ready to confront this now, then at least give her some space for a few days," he advised firmly. Damien's response was a subdued, "Understood." No sooner had Alec left than Damien's wolf gave a frustrated howl. Unable to contain the turmoil within, he transformed into a massive beast, after bursting through the door, racing toward the dense forest. The night air was cool against his fur as he sprinted deeper into the woods, his powerful muscles propelling him forward until he reached the forest's edge. There, at the brink of the wilderness, the beast paused, his sides heaving with heavy breaths. The pain of being separated from his mate was a physical ache, and he let out an ear-splitting howl that echoed through the trees, reverberating across the city like a mournful cry. Miles away, Alec's car screeched to a halt as he slammed on the brakes, the distant howl unmistakable. His heart clenched with understanding. "I wish I could do something for him," Alec muttered, the weight of his friend's suffering heavy on his conscience. He's in agony without her, and yet he refuses to let her know. How is he supposed to focus on anything else? Running a pack without a mate is hard enough for an alpha. On the opposite side of the city, in the Williams mansion, James brought Rebecca home. The family was adamant that she shouldn't be alone in her grief. Just as she was drifting into a fitful sleep, a distant howl pierced the night, jolting her awake and filling her with an inexplicable sense of alertness. The sound echoed in her mind, lingering like a whisper of something familiar and forgotten. Rebecca walked over to the window, drawn by a mix of unease and curiosity. The city was cloaked in darkness, but the dim moonlight revealed the forest, its silhouette a shadowy line against the night sky. As the howl faded into the distance, her gaze shifted upward. Amidst the sea of stars, one twinkled more brightly than the rest, catching her eye with its persistent shimmer. It instantly made her think of her mother. Sadness washed over her as she whispered to the night, "I miss you, Mom. I know that twinkling star is you." The thought brought a bittersweet comfort, a reminder of her mother's presence even in the vastness of the universe. 2.5 weeks had passed since Rebecca's mother had died. The days had been long and heavy with grief, but she was determined to find some semblance of normalcy. As she prepared to step out for a walk, the doorbell rang, its chime resonating through the quiet house. Rebecca paused, recognizing the familiar voice that followed. Her heart lifted slightly as she went to open the door, a smile already forming on her lips. "I know she has come to check up on me," she thought. Standing on the doorstep was Hayley, her bright presence a welcome relief. "Hey, Bex." Hayley greeted her with warmth. "Hey, come on in," Rebecca replied, stepping aside to let her friend enter. As soon as Hayley was inside, she enveloped Rebecca in a bear hug, her arms squeezing tight. Rebecca's arms were pinned to her sides, unable to return the embrace. You are going to choke me," she managed to say with a slight laugh, grateful for her comforting presence. The hug was exactly what she needed, a moment of connection that reminded her she wasn't alone. As soon as she was released, Hayley took a step back, looking slightly embarrassed. "Oh, sorry," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Rebecca smiled warmly. "It's okay," she reassured her, her heart lighter for having someone to share the moment with. "I'm happy to see you," Hayley continued, her smile widening. "Me too," Rebecca replied, feeling a genuine sense of comfort. "I miss you so much at work, you know," Hayley added, her tone bright with sincerity. "Yeah," Rebecca replied, her voice quieter. She felt a twinge of sadness. The camaraderie of work felt far away, lost in the haze of her recent grief. "She looks weak," Hayley thought in concern. Rebecca had joined Scar's enterprise as a senior photographer 2 months ago. It was a pleasant surprise when Alec conducted her interview, and an even bigger one to discover Hayley worked there too. This twist of fate quickly turned their shared workplace into the foundation of a blossoming friendship. As a senior photographer, Rebecca's role was both demanding and exhilarating. She spearheaded major projects, from high-profile advertising campaigns to intricate editorial shoots. Her keen eye for detail and creative vision set her apart, capturing moments that told compelling stories. She frequently collaborated with the design team, brainstorming and bringing concepts to life through her lens. Her days were a mix of studio sessions and on-location shoots, each with its own challenges. Whether in a controlled studio or unpredictable outdoor settings, Rebecca thrived on the diversity. The job required long hours and a relentless pursuit of perfection. But Rebecca loved it. Seeing her work featured in major campaigns and publications made it worthwhile. With Hayley by her side, the workplace started to feel like a second home. Hayley's expression shifted to one of curiosity. "So, you going somewhere?" she asked, glancing at the coat Rebecca held in her hand. "I was heading out for a walk," she replied. "Do you mind if I join you?" Hayley asked, and Rebecca nodded, grateful for the company. "I'd like that." As they prepared to head out together, Rebecca felt comfort knowing she had someone to face the challenges with. The path ahead seemed less daunting, filled with hope and warmth from true companionship. In just a few weeks, Hayley had become more than a good friend. She was a lifeline. Hayley brought confidence and clarity to Rebecca's life, cutting through her defenses and making her see things clearly. Hayley studied her face for a moment before asking, "I know this question is pointless, but are you doing okay?" The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Rebecca knew this silence is not the answer Hayley is looking for. "You know you can't lie to me," Hayley continued gently. Rebecca sighed, her defenses slowly crumbling as she barely managed a whisper. "I need time." "Of course," Hayley replied, her tone filled with unwavering support and understanding. Walking a few more steps ahead, Rebecca seemed lost in her thoughts, the weight of the past few weeks evident in her demeanor. Hayley watched her carefully, sensing the internal struggle her friend was going through. Finally, she decided to approach the subject that had been on her mind. "Bex," Hayley began cautiously, "you should at least try and change your environment." Rebecca interrupted, her voice laced with a tinge of frustration. "Change is what I am going through right now, Hayley. I don't think I can handle more of it." Hayley gently pressed. I was referring to altering your daily routine, Bex. You won't be on your road to healing any time soon if you keep yourself locked up inside those four walls. Rebecca felt a pang of resistance. That is my sanctuary, she thought, grappling with the idea of change. Observing her closely, Hayley thought, she's like the sister I never had. It pains me to see her like this. You're my best friend, Bex, Hayley said softly, her voice filled with earnest concern. Please, don't shut me out. Rebecca, who rarely allowed herself to be vulnerable, struggled as tears threatened to fall and shatter her carefully held composure. She met Hayley's gaze, finding it filled with genuine worry, and felt a wave of emotional release she could no longer contain. Hayley, distressed by the sight of Rebecca's tears, thought bitterly, Congratulations, Hayley. You've made her cry. What a friend you are. She quickly reached out, her voice trembling. I am so sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. Please remember, though, that we are all here for you. Rebecca, struggling to find words, replied, I know. I feel so lost. Under her breath, she whispered, I just don't know what to do anymore. Hayley, though, caught her words. Believe me when I say I understand what it feels like to lose a parent, Hayley said softly. Her own past echoed with pain, though different. When my father left without a word, it shattered something within me. Hayley's eyes reflected her own sorrow. I felt adrift for a long time, questioning my worth. While it's not the same, the essence of feeling abandoned and alone is something I can relate to. She continued with gentle conviction. The point is, we need the support of those who care about us, Bex. No one can truly help unless you allow them to. Life is about moving forward, even when it feels impossible. Hayley, still troubled by the emotional weight of their conversation, hesitated before speaking earnestly. Could you please try to let us all in? Rebecca's voice was soft, but resolute, as she replied, I will try. Hayley offered a grateful smile at her response. A few minutes later, they decided to take a pause from their stroll and found a nearby bench. As they settled down, the quiet of the park enveloped them, offering a brief respite from their earlier conversation. With a nervous shift in her stance, Hayley began, I came here to ask you something. What is it? Rebecca inquired, Hayley's expression shifting to one of mock seriousness. I don't want people mistaking you for a blood-sucking vampire. Now do I? Rebecca's lips twitched into a soft chuckle at Hayley's dramatic tone. Hayley's playful demeanor softened as she continued, I am genuinely worried. Rebecca's amusement faded, replaced by a thoughtful silence. Hayley's concern was evident, though she tried to mask it with humor. You've been spending so much time indoors that the town authorities might soon come to crucify you, Hayley added with a sarcastic edge. Rebecca laughed softly, shaking her head. You're crazy, she replied, her tone light, despite the underlying sadness. Hayley nodded. I know, but I need to make sure you don't lose your sanity in the process. Hayley's expression softened into a warm smile. Please, come back to the office? Rebecca sighed, her smile fading. Hayley. No, please don't, Hayley interjected before Rebecca could finish. Rebecca's eyes filled with sadness as she shook her head. I can't, she said quietly. Hayley's face remained resolute. Nothing you can say this time will make me give in. I want you at the office once the weekend is over. Rebecca looked confused, struggling to find words. End of discussion, Hayley said firmly. Rebecca tried to protest. But Bex, you're not going to get any better alone. You need a change of routine, Hayley insisted, her eyes earnest. Rebecca's shoulders slumped slightly as she looked at Hayley. Please come back to work, she urged again softly. After a few more arguments, Rebecca finally relented. She knew from experience that when Hayley decided on something, she rarely left room for debate. Her determination was both a blessing and a curse. But in moments like these, Rebecca was grateful for her friend's unwavering support. Rebecca finally gave in, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. Okay, you win. I give up. Hayley's face lit up with victory. Yes! Rebecca couldn't help but tease. Jerk. Hayley shot back with a playful grin. Bitch. The playful banter between them seemed to lighten the mood, and Hayley managed to lift Rebecca's spirits. There was no doubt she had a way of bringing out Rebecca's lighter side, and today was no exception. The laughter and light-hearted conversation between them felt like a balm to Rebecca's weary soul, reminding her that even in the darkest times, there was still room for joy and friendship. As they walked back home, Hayley stopped for a coffee before eventually heading off. Stepping back into the office after nearly 3 weeks felt like walking into a different world. It was as if an eternity had passed since Rebecca last saw these walls. Her cabin on the 7th floor, with its clean, simple lines, felt both familiar and strangely distant. The studio room at the end of the hall, her own little world, seemed like it belonged to a different lifetime. Every corner of the office seemed to echo with the well-meaning condolences from her colleagues, each one pulling her deeper into the haze of memories of her mother. Their sympathetic gestures were like shadows, reminding her of the absence that still lingered so profoundly. Rebecca thought before opening the door to her cabin, I just hope I can get through today without losing it. With a deep breath, she steeled herself for the day ahead, clinging to the hope that the routine of work might offer some semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos of her emotions. At lunchtime, Hayley whisked her away from the office to a cozy cafe, a small oasis amidst the city's hustle. As they settled into their seats, the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. The meal before her was the first real food she'd had in days, and though it didn't erase her worries, it offered a semblance of comfort. Though the day at the office had started sluggishly, she pushed herself to catch up, striving to regain her footing amidst the familiar yet foreign surroundings. Becca stared at her half-eaten sandwich, her thoughts clearly miles away. The strain of returning to work after weeks of absence was evident in her furrowed brow. As she picked at her meal, Hayley, ever the perceptive, leaned in slightly, her voice gentle but probing questions about her day so far. Rebecca replied dejectedly, I'm struggling to catch up. The magazine shoot was only halfway complete, and the covers still untouched. Hayley's eyes softened as she responded, It must be overwhelming, Bex. But how about taking a moment to organize your workspace? Maybe it could really help. Clearing a bit of the clutter might help clear your mind and get you back on track. Hayley's thoughtful suggestion brought a sense of relief to Becca. The idea of organizing the chaos seemed like a manageable step toward reclaiming her routine and easing back into her work. After lunch, she made her way to the studio, determined to confront the disarray of her work. The studio, a sanctuary of creativity, remained untouched since her departure. The familiar hum of the lights flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the room that seemed frozen in time. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for the task ahead. Her schedule had been clear of shoots for days, with the pressing interviews taking precedence. The yearly magazine cover, once a looming deadline, now seemed a distant concern, delayed until next month due to the unresolved model choice. As she scanned the studio, memories of her previous workdays flashed before her eyes. Her team had updated her on the status of the video interviews, but the delay in the cover shoot left her feeling unsettled. She coughed lightly, as the air in the room felt tinged with dust from days of inactivity, tickling her throat. Her voice echoed slightly in the empty studio as she began to search through the clutter. Where did I put those samples from last month? The once familiar space now felt oddly alien. The task of finding her misplaced samples, a tangible reminder of her interrupted routine, and the weight of returning to work. Becca sighed and resigned herself to clear the clutter in her cabin later. Her focus shifted to locating the samples and sorting through the other items in the studio first. Meanwhile, Damien entered the building, his presence almost a surprise after being absent for the past few days. Damien had been drowning himself in a sea of responsibilities, busy with seminars and pack business, attending one meeting after another. He had pushed himself to the brink, seeking a state of blissful exhaustion that left no room for thoughts of a certain redhead. The reckless work schedule was his way of escaping the loneliness and the chaos of his own mind. Today, however, he felt a need for respite from the external chaos and decided to spend the day at the office. As soon as he stepped inside, a familiar scent hit him hard. It was unmistakable and overwhelming. He could feel his mate's presence permeating the air, awakening emotions he had tried so hard to suppress. She's back! The realization surged through him like a tidal wave, awakening a longing that he had buried beneath layers of duty and distraction. He couldn't wait for the elevator, couldn't stand still. And so he took the stairs, racing upward, each step echoing his growing anticipation. It was a relief that Alec wasn't in the office today. The 7th floor was their domain, a place where Damien could breathe without pretense, without having to wear the mask of control he donned for the world. He reached the 7th floor, breathless but driven, following the invisible thread that led him to her. Outside the studio room, he paused, his heart pounding in his chest. Through the window, he saw Rebecca, her silhouette framed by the soft light inside, moving with a familiar grace as she organized the chaos she had left behind. The sight of her, after what felt like an eternity, was almost too much to bear. He stood outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Should he go in? His heart screamed yes, but doubt crept in, whispering uncertainties. What could he say to her? How could he bridge the chasm that had grown between them in these silent weeks? Standing there, torn between his longing to see her and the fear of rejection, he watched her, every fiber of his being yearning to close the distance, to be near her. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken emotions, and a hope that maybe, just maybe, today could be the start of something new. Damien watched Becca through the glass, unable to tear his eyes away. She looks so... The thought trailed off in his mind, his heart swelling with unspoken emotions. There was something about seeing her again that made everything else fade into the background, a vibrant thread pulling him forward. His wolf, always a force of instinct and desire, urged him onward. You should go talk to her. Right now. The voice was insistent, impossible to ignore. With a determined breath, Damien twisted the doorknob, opening the door to the studio. Inside, The lights were low, casting soft shadows across the space. It was just the way she liked it, an oasis of calm in the chaos of the world. She was absorbed in her work, her attention focused on the pictures spread before her, oblivious to Damien's presence. Damien stood there for a moment. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. Subtly, he cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. Just then, a picture slipped from her hand and disappeared under the table. She bent down to retrieve it, and Damien took a step forward, his presence now undeniable. "Becca," he called softly, his voice carrying across the quiet room. It was a simple word, but it held a world of meaning, a bridge over the distance that had kept them apart. Damien's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unexpected. It wasn't just the sound that startled her, but the way he called her by the unfamiliar nickname, Becca instead of Miss Hastings. The unexpected familiarity caught her off guard, and in her haste to respond, she jerked up from beneath the table, only to misjudge the space and collide with the sharp edge of the table. "Ouch!" she cried out, the pain radiating from her forehead. She winced, pressing a hand to the sore spot as she clumsily scrambled out from under the table. Her head throbbed, but the sting was quickly overshadowed by the embarrassment of the moment. Damien stretched out his arms, instinctively wanting to help her up from her crouched position, but held himself back at the last moment. As she straightened up, her eyes met Damien's, and she saw the concern etched on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, laced with worry. Rebecca nodded, trying to brush off the pain and the awkwardness that hung in the air. "Yes, I'm fine," she managed, though her head still pulsed with a dull ache. She rubbed the sore spot again, feeling a little foolish for her clumsy reaction. Damien took a step closer, his gaze not leaving her face. That looked like it hurt. Becca forced a smile, trying to downplay the situation. Just a bump. Nothing to worry about. But as she met his eyes again, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his concern than only her injury. The way he'd called her Becca lingered in her mind, a small, unsettling shift in the way she saw him. Taking in her appearance, he mentioned, "You still look a bit disoriented." The mate bond pull had grown irresistibly strong, transforming him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Over the past few days, a newfound determination had ignited in his eyes, filling him with a sense of purpose that had been absent for weeks. Becca blinked up at him, her expression confused. "Yes, I wasn't expecting anyone to show up here," she replied, flustered, a hint of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. Her thoughts were momentarily scrambled by his presence, and she blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "Why are you... were you running?" Damien let out a small puff of air, trying to play it cool. "I came through the stairs." "All the way up to this floor?" Becca interrupted, her eyes wide with disbelief. Damien nodded, masking his embarrassment. The elevator was occupied. He offered the excuse smoothly, hoping she wouldn't question it too much. He couldn't very well tell her that it was the urgency of seeing her that had driven him up those flights of stairs. The unspoken truth lingered between them, the mate bond a powerful force drawing them closer. Damien's intense gaze was impossible to ignore, his eyes fixed unwaveringly on Rebecca. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. She cleared her throat, trying to steady herself as she blinked and shifted her weight from one leg to the other, a habit she had picked up whenever she felt unsure or nervous. Her voice was tentative as she broke the silence. "Was there something you wanted to discuss?" she asked, trying to sound casual despite feeling the weight of his stare. Damien's eyes softened slightly, and he took a step closer, his demeanor a mix of resolve and vulnerability. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I know things have been difficult lately, but I am glad to see you back." His voice carried a mix of relief and surprise. Becca raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp. "Would you rather I hadn't come back?" A flicker of emotion crossed Damien's face, a pang of regret piercing his heart for the troubles she must have endured. He couldn't ignore the transformation in her, the newfound maturity and strength that radiated from her. "No. It is reassuring to have you back. In the office, I mean. I feared you might not return so soon. Or perhaps not at all," he admitted, his words carefully chosen. Although they were alone in the room, and likely on the entire floor, their voices were hushed, as if the moment were too fragile to risk shattering. Rebecca's heartbeat quickened, and she unknowingly tilted her head, confusion clouding her expression as she asked, "Why would you think I would not?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, carrying an undertone of genuine curiosity. Damien's reply was thoughtful, as if weighing the significance of his words. "I imagined you might need more time, perhaps a longer respite to find your footing again." His statement lingered between them, prompting her to question whether she had misheard. "What makes him think that?" Becca pondered, trying to understand his perspective. Did he really believe I would abandon everything? She dipped her head, grateful for his concern, yet feeling awkward and honest at the same time. "It's been tough," she admitted, her gaze dropping momentarily to the floor before meeting his again, "but I'm getting through it." In the silence that followed, they stood on the brink of unspoken confessions, each grappling with the delicate balance of their emotions and expectations. Damien decided to drop the pretenses and, for once, reveal what he truly felt. "Rebecca," he began, his voice low and filled with emotion, "I've been waiting for days to say this." His gaze held hers, a reflection of shared grief and understanding. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss. I am so sorry." Something about the way he said her name stirred a deep chord within her, cliché as it might sound. It was as though her pain was laid bare before him, and he didn't shy away. Instead, he offered the silent promise of a shoulder to lean on. "I can see it in your eyes, the pain," Damien continued, his voice steady yet tender. "I can't begin to imagine what you're going through right now." He paused, his words acting like a key that unlocked a floodgate. Her voice trembled in response. "Losing a parent. It shatters something deep inside you." Unwelcomed tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill down her cheeks. Damien stepped forward once again, minimizing further distance between them. His gray eyes met her blue ones, full of empathy and warmth. For a moment, they stood together in the quiet room, a shared understanding passing between them. His presence was a balm, soothing the raw edges of her grief, offering a connection she hadn't realized she craved. Damien's voice was gentle, yet firm. "I know that nothing I say can truly ease your pain, but please know this." He paused as if choosing his words with care. "Your mother, Ellin, was a good soul. I'm so sorry you had to lose her so soon. I had the pleasure of meeting her twice before." His words halted. Hearing him speak of her mother, Rebecca felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow crash over her. The mere mention of her mother's name unlocked a torrent of memories, each one piercing her heart with a bittersweet ache. Her grief was palpable, a raw wound that refused to heal. Tears start to stream down her face, unchecked and unrelenting, each drop a silent cry for the irreplaceable loss she endured and the boundless love she still carried for her mother. What is it about him that makes me want to spill all my thoughts? Becca wondered, feeling an inexplicable pull toward him. It was as if his presence alone could unravel the tightly wound threads of her heart, compelling her to share the deepest parts of her soul. "You came to her funeral," Becca interjected, her words more a statement than a question. For a moment, Damien Scar, a man she had always seen as composed and unshakable, looked down, as if the weight of the silence was too much to bear. "I did. I couldn't say much," he confessed. Regret filled his voice. "I wish I could have stayed there. Longer," he murmured, closing his eyes as if to shield himself from the sound of her sobs. "With you," he thought silently. "I didn't want to leave you alone in such a state, but I felt utterly helpless." Instead, he confessed, "I didn't know how to comfort you, and there was nothing I could do to truly ease your pain." Becca's breath hitched as she let out a quiet sob, her defenses crumbling. Damien's presence, steady and unwavering, was a stark contrast to the tumultuous storm inside her. Taking a deep breath, Damien lifted his gaze from the ground, his pain barely concealed, as he watched her completely break down in front of him. Her silent hiccups echoed in the stillness, each one a testament to her overwhelming sorrow. Struggling to maintain her balance, she placed one trembling hand on the table behind her, feeling as though her legs might give out from the sheer weight of her despair. Her body shook, and she whimpered softly, tears now flowing freely. In front of the one person she had sworn she would never show such vulnerability, she found herself utterly unable to hold back. Her defenses crumbled in the face of her profound loss. Footsteps echoed on the cold, tiled floor as Damien closed the space between them, no longer able to resist the pull toward her. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around Becca, gentle yet firm, offering a quiet refuge she hadn't realized she needed. The scent of cedarwood and musk surrounded her, grounding her in the moment, steadying the whirlwind inside. A soft breath brushed her ear before his voice followed, low and sure, carrying more meaning than the words alone. "Just remember, I am right here by your side. You are not alone," he murmured, his voice steady and reassuring, his breath warm against her skin. A broken whimper escaped Becca, her chest tightening with unbearable grief. "She was all I had," she whispered, her tears sinking into his shirt. "I know," Damien said softly, "but you're not as alone as you think." I can't," she gasped, her voice trembling like fragile glass. "I don't know how to do this without her. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending." "Shh. Don't," he murmured, pulling her closer. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek became an anchor, grounding her in his warmth. "She's still with you, remember, always, and wherever she is now, she's at peace." In Damien's arms, the crushing weight of her grief eased, just slightly, but enough to let her breathe. His warmth, his quiet strength, wrapped around her like a cocoon, offering solace in the midst of her raw vulnerability. For the first time in what felt like forever, the darkness didn't feel endless. His presence became a bridge between her sorrow and the distant possibility of healing. A quiet reminder that she wasn't alone. The soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of the city blurred into nothingness, leaving only the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the reassuring presence of this man who, against all odds, made the world feel a little less empty. Inside Damien's mind, the weight of his actions pressed heavily on him. The mate bond between them was growing stronger, pulling them closer with every shared moment. Yet, right now, that bond was the least of his concerns. His focus was solely on her grief, her pain, and the comfort he could offer. If his presence could ease even a fraction of her suffering, he would bear whatever consequences came with it. This bond is testing me more than I ever expected, Damien thought, his resolve hardening as he held her closer. The warmth of her body against his, the delicate scent of her hair, and the quiet tremble of her sobs. Each detail seared into his memory, impossible to ignore. After what felt like an eternity, Becca's eyes fluttered open, a sudden realization settling over her. She had been crying on Damien Scar's shoulder. As the weight of that truth sank in, he eased back slightly, though his hands lingered on her shoulders, reluctant to fully let go. His gray eyes searched hers, laced with concern, and something else she couldn't quite name. But as a flush of embarrassment crept in, she quickly lowered her gaze. She sniffled, blinking rapidly as the moment caught up to her. With her head bowed, she focused on steadying her breath, willing the tears to stop. The rawness of it all left her feeling exposed, uncertain, her heart hammering against her ribs. Damien, sensing her unease, instinctively reached up to wipe away her tears. But the moment she flinched, he froze. A flicker of guilt crossed his face before he withdrew his hand, stepping back, putting space between them. The distance felt unnatural, almost unbearable, but he respected it. He had already towed the fragile line between them. A heavy silence settled, thick with emotions neither of them could put into words. The air between them was charged, crackling with something neither of them could quite name. They stood at the edge of something unfamiliar, something dangerous, yet impossible to ignore. Damien's voice pulled Becca back from the storm of emotions threatening to consume her. "Are you feeling any lighter?" His tone was steady, a quiet force grounding her in the moment. Sniffling, she wiped at her damp cheeks, her gaze catching on the dark stain marring his shirt. A flicker of guilt surfaced before the words tumbled out, soft and unguarded. "I ruined your shirt." Damien chuckled softly, a sound so unexpected that it left Becca momentarily stunned. She blinked up at him, caught off guard by the rare glimpse of warmth on his face. He barely smiled, let alone laughed, and something about it unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite explain. His usually guarded eyes held a softness she wasn't used to seeing as he shook his head. "Don't worry about it," he said, brushing off her apology with an easy wave of his hand. Rebecca sniffled, steadying herself with a slow, measured breath. But before she could retreat into the silence, Damien's voice broke through, low, steady, and carrying a weight that settled deep within her. "I've never experienced a loss like yours, Rebecca, but if there's one thing I know, it's that your mother would be proud of the woman you've become. You're strong, kind, and resilient. Don't ever change that for anyone." His gaze remained soft, unwavering, and as he leaned in slightly, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over Becca. The moment held an unfamiliar weight, stirring something deep within her. Overwhelmed, The words tumbled out in a rushed or nervous breath. Thank you." Damien reached for a tissue from behind the table and handed it to her without a word. She accepted it with a small nod, dabbing at her face as she tried to steady herself. The weight of her emotions pressed down, but she forced herself to refocus. With a quick, almost mechanical movement, she turned to gather the file and pictures she had left on the table, her fingers fumbling slightly in her haste. Damien noticed her abrupt shift, the way she withdrew, desperate to put space between them, and from the moment they had shared. But he remained silent, watching her as she twisted away from him. Just as she was about to walk away, he reached out, his fingers closing gently around her wrist. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," he murmured, his voice laced with quiet regret. Rebecca hesitated, her pulse quickening at the unexpected contact. No, it's fine. I just..." She swallowed hard, flustered. "I should go." Before he could say another word, she slipped from his grasp and rushed out the door, her hurried footsteps echoing down the hall. Damien stood frozen, watching the empty space where she had just been. The room, moments ago charged with emotion, now felt hollow, filled only with the silence of everything left unsaid. Rebecca hurried down the hallway, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoing through the silence. She silently thanked her luck that her cabin was on the same floor, and as soon as she entered, she closed the door firmly behind her, leaning against it for a brief second as she sucked in a shaky breath. Crossing the room in quick, unsteady strides, she reached her desk and dropped everything onto its surface with little care. Her fingers trembled slightly as she grabbed a glass of water, downing it in one go, as if the cool liquid could somehow drown out the storm churning inside her. Setting the empty glass down, Becca slowly sank into her chair, her body finally succumbing to the exhaustion she had been fighting. Panic began to creep in as the reality of what had just occurred in the studio room settled over her. The encounter with Damien had left her feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated. Confused, she ran a hand through her rough locks, her fingers tangling in the mess of hair that hadn't seen proper care in days. Her other hand rested over her chest, where her heart pounded erratically against her ribcage. The beat was loud and frantic, echoing in her ears, and she wasn't sure if it was from the hurried walk back to her cabin or the emotional breakdown she had just endured. Closing her eyes, she tried to steady her breathing, hoping that Damien's comforting words and the warmth of his embrace would stop replaying in her mind. It was overwhelming. Too much. Too fast. The weight of it pressed down on her, making her breath come in quick, shallow gasps. Her heart pounded erratically, caught in a storm she felt couldn't be escaped. A few minutes passed before Rebecca's mind began to clear. As she reflected on her past weeks at the office, one thought stood out. Never had Damien been this personal with her. If anything, they had clashed more times than she could count, arguing over the smallest project details. He was always composed, guarded, and impossibly unreadable. Yet today, something had shifted. He had been different, gentler, more present, and that unsettled her. Despite the whirlwind of emotions, she couldn't deny the strange lightness settling over her. The tension from the morning, the weight of endless condolences, all seemed to fade, replaced by an unexpected sense of relief. But why? And more importantly, who was Damien's scar beneath that hardened exterior? Was he truly this compassionate, Or was she seeing a side of him that wasn't meant for just any employee? Her confusion deepened as she frowned, voicing her thoughts aloud in hopes to make sense of it all. What has gotten into him? Why did he... The words faded, leaving her with nothing but unanswered questions. She hadn't expected to cross paths with Damien today, let alone in such a vulnerable state. With a heavy sigh, she leaned back in her chair, tilting her head against the headrest as she closed her eyes. The exhaustion from the emotional roller coaster of the day began to catch up with her, overwhelming her senses. For a moment, she allowed herself to surrender to it, letting the tension drain from her body as she drifted into a state of reluctant rest, still grappling with the conflicting emotions that Damien's unexpected kindness had stirred within her. Rebecca spent the rest of the day holed up in her room, venturing out only when she was sure she wouldn't run into a certain steely-eyed alpha. Unbeknownst to her, Damien was well aware of her presence and her avoidance, but he chose not to confront her, leaving the office immediately after. Back at his home, Damien's mind was a whirlwind, replaying the day's events. Relief washed over him at seeing his mate again, but a growing unease settled in. How was he supposed to keep his distance now? The mate bond was tightening its hold with each passing day. Until one of them either embraced or rejected the bond, the days ahead would only grow more agonizing, especially for Damien and his wolf. Being human, Rebecca remained blissfully unaware of the storm building within her very soul. Damien's anger simmered just beneath the surface, his fists clenched at his sides. This mate bond, it's tearing me apart, he muttered under his breath. I can't let it control me, I won't. But as the words left his lips, his resolve wavered, his jaw tightened, and for a fleeting moment his voice softened. I can't lose myself around her. Not like this. His wolf's growl echoed in his mind, more forceful than ever. And why not? What are you so afraid of? Damien groaned inwardly. She is clueless of our bond. She is a human after all. The wolf's voice softened, almost pleading. Can't you feel it? You're pushing us both to the edge. And I don't know how much longer I can hold on without her. There was a pause, a fleeting moment of raw vulnerability, before the wolf urged, When will you tell her the truth, Damien? Do you really think I care that she's human? His voice carried both frustration and longing as he continued, How much longer can you keep us trapped in this agony? End this, before it breaks us. Damien's thoughts flared up in defiance as he silently declared, We are not weak. But even as he tried to steel himself, his wolf's voice cut through the turmoil. You saw her today. It's wearing her down too. Never, Damien resolved fiercely within his mind, refusing to give in. How long can you keep the truth buried? The wolf pressed, relentless in its pursuit. Damien's anger and fear mingled as he thought with renewed determination. She won't know. The wolf's voice resonated with a heavy inevitability. She will find out, Damien. Eventually. She has to. His voice faltered before the next words came, laden with sorrow. Unless you plan on rejecting her. But even then, you'd have to stand before her and say it to her face. The word rejection made Damien's heart clench painfully, but he forced himself to remain silent, shoving the wolf back into the recesses of his mind before it could seize control. With a final, mournful warning, the wolf continued, There's no escaping this mate bond, Damien, and the consequences will be devastating if you keep running. As the wolf retreated, Exhaustion settled over Damien like a heavy cloak. The battle within had drained him, leaving him alone with the truth he was desperately trying to avoid. Deep down, he knew this wasn't fair. To the wolf, to himself, or to her. She was his, chosen by fate. And yet, the longer he denied it, the more it tore at him, weakening his wolf in ways he didn't want to acknowledge. But the inevitable was drawing closer with each passing day. Soon, the truth would unravel. Soon, everyone would know who his mate was, and there would be no more hiding from the consequences.